hospital emergency room runs on one rule: triage by need, not by net worth. A construction worker with a crushed leg and a tech founder with the same injury get the same painkillers, the same surgeon, the same bed. No form asks for a bank statement. No clipboard asks who matters more. That rule did not come from medicine. It came from a sentence written down roughly 3,000 years ago in a desert, como fel, by people with no hospitals, no courts, and no concept of equality as we use the word today. The sentence says humans were made in the image of God. Just that, no qualifiers. Not kings in the image of God, not priests, not men over women or one tribe over another. Every human stamped with the same value, muka, before they have done anything to earn it or anything to lose it. Pull that sentence out of history, and the triage chart does not just change. It might never have existed at all. Before that sentence, value was not assumed. It was assigned. Every major civilization writing law before Genesis ranked people the same way they ranked livestock or land: by output, by bloodline, by usefulness to the state. The Code of Hammurabi, carved in stone around 1750 BC, priced human life on a sliding scale. Strike a free man and the fine is one amount. Strike a slave and the fine drops to a fraction of that, because the slave was property, not a person with independent worth. Genesis 1:27 broke that scale on purpose. Humankind, made in the image of God, male and female alike. Not the king, not the priestly class, not the strong over the weak. The claim was structural. Worth was not a reward for status. It was the starting condition given before any action, any achievement, any utility was demonstrated. This idea has a name. Theologians call it Imago Dei, the image of God. But strip away the theology for a moment and look at what it actually did as a legal and philosophical premise. It planted one specific claim into human thought that almost no other ancient legal system contained: that a person's value does not depend on what they can do. That single claim is the quiet, load-bearing wall. Take it away, and every civilization around Genesis-era Israel still had a perfectly functional, perfectly coherent alternative. Worth by birth, worth by strength, worth by service to the state. Rome ran an empire for centuries on exactly that logic. And it worked, in the sense that empires can run for centuries on almost anything. What it could not produce, on its own, was the idea that a slave and a senator shared the same fundamental status as human beings. Rome had philosophers who flirted with universal reason. Stoics like Epictetus, himself a former slave, who argued that all humans shared a spark of divine logos. But even Stoicism never fully detached worth from social function. The empire kept its slaves. Imago Dei did something different. It did not argue that everyone should be treated equally in practice, not at first, and history shows that gap clearly. But it left behind a written, repeatable, citable claim that could be picked back up centuries later by people looking for a reason to challenge a hierarchy they were born into. And it was picked back up repeatedly, each time by someone standing inside a system that profited from ranking humans by usefulness, pointing at one sentence and asking why the system did not match the claim. The first place that sentence got picked up was not a courtroom. It was a letter. In the 1st century, a man named Paul wrote to a small Christian community in Galatia and said something that, on paper, should have been irrelevant to Roman law. "There is no longer slave or free," he wrote, "no longer male or female. All are one." He was not writing legislation. He was describing a spiritual status. Inside a religious community that, at the time, had no political power at all. But ideas do not stay where they are written. 3 centuries later, that same idea started showing up in arguments against practices the Roman world had never seriously questioned. Infanticide, the abandonment of unwanted infants, especially girls, was common and legal across the empire. Early Christian writers opposed it specifically on the grounds that the infant carried the image of God, the same status as any adult, the same status as the person making the decision to abandon it. By the 4th century, under Christian emperors, Infant exposure was formally outlawed for the first time in Roman legal history. That is one small link in the chain. Here is the next. Centuries later, in the writings of medieval theologians like Thomas Aquinas, the Imago Dei concept was fused with a separate idea from Roman and Greek philosophy. Natural law, the belief that some moral truths exist independent of any king's decree, or written into the structure of reality itself. Aquinas argued that because humans bear the image of God, they possess reason and free will, and because of that, certain things are owed to every person, regardless of what any government says. That fusion is the hinge. Natural law on its own was an abstract philosophical position. Imago Dei on its own was a religious claim with no legal teeth. Combined, they produced something new. The idea that a person has rights that exist prior to and independent of the state. Not granted by a king, not earned through service, built in. Jump forward again to the 1600s and 1700s. Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke took that fused idea and stripped much of the explicit religious language off it while keeping the structure intact. Locke argued that all humans are born with natural rights to life, liberty, and property, rights no government creates and no government can legitimately erase. Locke's language shows up almost word for word decades later in the opening of the Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Unalienable rights. Endowed not by Congress, not by the King of England, but by something the document calls the Creator. Trace that phrase backward far enough, through Locke, through Aquinas, through Augustine, through Paul's letter to a small church in Galatia, and it ends at the same sentence: humans made in the image of God. Remove that first link, and every later link has nothing to attach to. Natural law theory still might exist as an abstract philosophical exercise, but the specific claim that grounded it, that worth is inherent and universal because it was placed there at creation, has no origin point. Someone, somewhere, would have had to invent an equivalent claim from scratch, using a different argument in a different century, possibly never reaching the same conclusion at all. By 1948, that chain of ideas had a name and a document: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted in the aftermath of a war that had just demonstrated on an industrial scale what happens when a state decides certain humans fall outside the category of full personhood. Article 1 of that document states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. No qualifier for nationality, no qualifier for usefulness to the state. The drafting committee included voices from multiple religious and philosophical traditions, and one of its key architects, the French philosopher Jacques Maritain, was explicit that the document needed a foundation that could survive translation across cultures that did not share a single religion. What they landed on was, functionally, a secularized version of the same claim: inherent dignity, not earned, not assigned by government, present from birth in everyone equally. Now run the removal forward. If Genesis 1:27 had never been written, the 1948 Declaration does not simply get rewritten with different footnotes. The entire philosophical lineage that fed into it, Paul's letter, Aquinas' natural law, Stuma, Locke's unalienable rights, Jefferson's creator-endowed liberty, has a missing root. Each of those thinkers was responding to, building on, or arguing within a tradition that assumed human worth was granted at creation, equally to everyone. Without that assumption, the default model that dominates the rest of recorded history reasserts itself. Worth by rank, worth by bloodline, worth by what you produce. That model is not hypothetical. It is what most of human civilization actually ran on for most of recorded history. Ancient Egypt structured an entire afterlife around the idea that only the pharaoh and the elite had souls capable of judgment and eternal life. Feudal Europe, even after Christianity arrived, took centuries to apply Imago Dei consistently. Serfs were still bound to land they did not own, and it took the slow pressure of that same idea, worth that does not depend on rank, to eventually dismantle the system. Take away the root claim entirely, and there is no guarantee a civilization independently reaches the conclusion that a person born into poverty has the same fundamental status as a person born into power. Some might. Confucian thought, for instance, developed its own strong tradition of universal moral worth through a completely different route, centered on innate human goodness rather than divine image. But Confucian ethics never produced a document like the Universal Declaration, built specifically around individual, inalienable, legally enforceable rights held against the state. The specific combination, universal worth plus individual rights plus enforceability against government power, traces through one lineage, and that lineage has one starting point. If you are watching this from a country where the law assumes by default that you cannot be enslaved, cannot be killed without trial, and cannot be stripped of basic dignity, no matter how poor or powerless you become, you are living inside the downstream effect of that one sentence. If something in this chain surprised you, that is worth sitting with for a second. Most people have never traced the line from a courtroom back to a creation story. Where do you think that line would have gone instead, if it had never started there at all? The cascade did not stop at courtrooms and declarations. It kept branching into places that have nothing to do with religion on the surface. Take the modern hospital. The entire field of medical ethics rests on a principle called the inherent dignity of the patient, language that shows up in professional codes for doctors and nurses worldwide. A patient in a coma, unable to speak, unable to produce anything, unable to repay anyone, still receives care under the same ethical obligation as anyone else. That obligation is not derived from the patient's usefulness. It is derived from their status as a person. Full stop. Now look at disability rights. For most of history, a person born with a severe physical or cognitive disability was, in many societies, considered to have diminished status. Sometimes formally, sometimes simply by being excluded from inheritance, citizenship, or basic protection. The modern legal framework that says a person with a disability has the same rights as anyone else, regardless of what they can or cannot contribute economically, is a direct extension of the same root claim. Worth that exists independent of output. Orphanages and child welfare systems run on it too. A child with no parents, no income, no ability to advocate for themselves, is nonetheless treated by law as a full legal person with protected rights. That was not the default position of the ancient world, where an unwanted or orphaned child could simply be left to die, legally, without consequence. Even something as ordinary as a wheelchair ramp on a building is a small physical artifact of this idea. The ramp exists because the law assumes the person who needs it has the same right to enter the building as anyone who can climb stairs. Remove the underlying assumption, and the ramp has no legal mandate behind it. It becomes a kindness someone might offer, not a requirement. Each of these, the Hospital Ethics Code, the Disability Rights Statute, the Child Welfare System, the Building Code, looks like a separate, modern, secular development. None of them cite Genesis. Most of the people who wrote them probably never thought about Genesis at all. But each one assumes, as a starting premise, that a human life has value that does not need to be proven, earned, or demonstrated. That premise has a traceable origin, and once you see it in one place, it becomes difficult not to see it everywhere it was quietly built into the structure. One sentence, written by people who never saw a hospital, a courtroom, or a wheelchair ramp, somehow ended up underneath all three. Not because anyone planned it that way, because an idea, once written down, outlives the world it was written in. It gets picked up by a letter, then a theologian, then a philosopher, then a room full of diplomats in 1948, each one translating it into the language their century understood. The triage chart in the emergency room does not mention any of this. It does not need to. The assumption is already built in.